want to make sure to greet the rest of the audience. Then we'll take a few more comments here coming up in just a moment. Tyler Leonard says, do you think that Saban just took Burton as a slap in the face to Kirby? I'm sure Saban promised him the world. Yeah, I don't think all of this is lost on Saban. As I told y'all before the national championship game, I don't think that Nick Saban likes Kirby Smart very much anymore. And there was an article that came out the day of the game. And by the way, let me say good morning, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, all of our video platforms. Good morning to you. We're in the process of finishing a couple of comments here from our first and 15. We're going to dive into the Burton news and get into the show after that. But just to finish the point that I was making a moment ago, there was an article that came out in Sports Illustrated the day of the national championship game, or like right before the national title game, that essentially, shined a spotlight on the way in which a lot of folks that have known both these guys feel like the Kirby-Saban relationship has kind of deteriorated a little bit. So the idea that Saban got to take a player from Kirby, that's not the only reason I believe he did it. I believe he ultimately did it because he thinks Burton's a good player, and he is. But did Saban enjoy doing this, kind of stirring up a little trouble in comparison to Georgia here? My guess is that he probably did. A couple other comments. We'll get ready to get going. Brad Hotnett rolling his eyes at the idea that the Michigan-Bama game was just a bunch of dinks and dunks, and I frankly roll my eye at that there as well. I do, Brad, just to be completely honest. Barry Watkins says, I don't know what that means, but funny from Barry, I guess. Let's see what else. Cat Story also referencing Matthew Stafford. What a moment it was for him. I mean, it's kind of crazy. I said the Buffalo-Kansas City game may be the greatest game I've ever seen, and at least at the NFL level, and it completely obscures a Tampa-LA game that in its own right was the kind of thing that you sort of thought the world would be talking about all day today. Tampa was down 27-3, came back to tie the game, only to see Stafford lead the game-winning drive there late with a couple of huge throws. That obviously was a wild game in its own right, and yet it's going to be completely obscured by the fact that, was it 20-something points scored in like 90 seconds, whatever the overall numbers were, when it comes with what Allen and Mahomes were doing last night. It was truly a great weekend of NFL football. It really was. It was obviously great to see Stafford get himself a big moment there. A couple more. What else are we going to do here? Hassan checking in to say good morning. Appreciate that. Chadwick Ivory says, I think it's a strategic move by Saban, and obviously, Saban's much like Kirby Smart, always strategizing, always trying to put together the best roster that he can, and clearly for 2022, that's going to include Jermaine Burton. So as you might imagine, we're going to talk about this a lot on today's show. We'll get some thoughts from John Stinchcomb on this coming up in a moment. But generally speaking, I believe there are about 4 things on this Burton issue and the wide receiver conversation that's sort of left in the wake of all of this. There are about 4 things that I think are misunderstood. So I want to begin today's show by addressing that specifically. So for all of you who join us on all the video platforms here today live, we really appreciate you being with us. Should be a fun conversation as DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So in the midst of a weekend where everybody was, I think, pretty transfixed by what they saw from the NFL, and we'll even do a little bit of this on our show coming up in a moment, we were all kind of fixated on these great divisional round playoff games. There last night, in the midst of all of this, some pretty big news in the college football front involving Georgia in particular kind of shows up, where Jermaine Burton announces that he is now moving on to the University of Alabama. For those of you on video, I'll show you the Burton announcement on Instagram here where, he talks about Tuscaloosa, Alabama, gave you the hashtag RTR, which obviously stands for Roll Tide Roll. So Jermaine Burton on his way to Tuscaloosa to play for the Alabama Crimson Tide. And I think that this is obviously a big conversation among UGA fans because Burton's a good player and he's now going to help the team that Georgia just beat in the national championship game. This is going to get a lot of attention from a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And in observing the conversation here over the course of not quite 24 hours, but we're coming up on 24 hours that Georgia fans have talked about this, and kind of observing all of this, I think there are a handful of things that UGA fans, I believe, maybe college football fans at large, but certainly UGA fans are misunderstanding about all of this. And I want to address a few of these points here right now just for a moment. Let me start with this. That primarily the overwhelming majority of the folks who watch a show like this or listen to a show like this kind of view college football as a form of entertainment. And the way in which they get entertainment from college football is by watching the competition. Georgia trying to beat other teams and trying to stay on top of the college football world. That is primarily the mechanism by which they get entertainment from college football. And so in the immediate aftermath of Burton going to play for Georgia's arch nemesis, not its biggest rival, that's Florida. I don't know that I think of Georgia, Alabama as true rivals. I think of Alabama as more of a nemesis to the program. But when Burton goes and plays for Alabama, the immediate reaction by a lot of Georgia fans to that is negative, including myself there as well. Now, hopefully none of those people are trashing Burton or saying anything unfair, making it too personal or anything like that, but it's just natural there's going to be a level of dissatisfaction about Burton going to be on the team that Georgia just beat. And the response to some of that's going to be, well, you got to understand, Jermaine Burton's just trying to do what's best for him. He's just trying to think about his NFL future, blah, blah, blah. And my response back to that would be, well, no, I don't have to do anything, nor does any other Georgia fan have to do that either. That ultimately college football is still a sport about the name on the front of the jersey meaning more and mattering more than the name on the back of the jersey. As cliche as that sounds, that remains incredibly true here. Furthermore, to kind of, not put too fine of a point on this, but just to kind of expand out on it a little bit, but the moment college football becomes primarily about a vehicle for guys like Burton to improve their NFL future, the moment that college football becomes primarily viewed as a true feeder system for the NFL, at that point in time, that is when the popularity of college football does truly start to subside. That's when it does truly start to diminish. Now you'll say, well, BA, how do you know that? Because minor league sports aren't popular anywhere. There is an NBA G League. Have you ever watched one of those games? My guess is you probably have. There's even I think a G League team of some sort that even plays here in Atlanta, but for the most part, they just get completely ignored because minor league basketball is not the kind of thing that people really care about. Same thing for minor league baseball. We've all kind of grown up in the South with minor league teams, Birmingham Barons, wherever you might happen to live. But as a business model, minor league baseball is contracting. There are several hundred fewer minor league teams now than there used to be just a few years ago. Major league baseball is still incredibly popular, but the next generation of major league players playing at the minor league level, it's not very popular at all right now. In fact, it's kind of a struggling business. In some cases, it's even a failed business, just given the fact there are fewer minor league teams than there used to be. You can say the same thing about, say, Korn Ferry Tour and golf and all the other things you want to talk about there. There is just not much of an appetite for elite talent playing at the minor league level. The only way this seems to work in football, because, by the way, we've also tried a bunch of football leagues too, USFL or World League, all these, the one that played at the old Turner Field a couple years ago. All of these so-called minor league teams, spring football leagues, they can't even really get through a season because ultimately, even for a sport like football that everybody loves, there's just not a lot of market, not a lot of business to be built around the idea of minor league football. That college football works not because it's the next generation of NFL players, but because it's the next generation of NFL players wearing the uniforms of universities that people graduated from or states that people hail from. That ultimately, as I said before, it's not too trite to say that in college football, the name on the front of the jersey matters more than the name on the back. And so Georgia fans that are disappointed, a little bit frustrated that a guy like Burton would leave Georgia to go play for what they view in their mind the enemy, that is just a natural response to all of this. And then you kind of get to this whole notion of, well, BA, all of this is just some sort of rebuke of what Georgia is as a passing attack. That all of this is just somehow a reminder that Kirby Smart, he may win a national championship, and it's weird that people diminish that. He may have won a national championship, but when it comes to offensive football, he's got to get with the program. He's got to understand what guys like Jermaine Burton want, and Kirby Smart's got to try to find some way to serve guys like Burton at all costs. This was even kind of foreshadowed a little bit going back to Friday's show. Do you remember the Mississippi TV reporter who had, kind of tried to connect the dots between Lane Kiffin being in Athens and Jermaine Burton and JT Daniels being in the transfer portal? We'll show you that on the screen again if you may have forgotten. We told you at the time this had all the markings of fake news, and turns out it probably was. Actually, definitely is. The idea that Daniels and Burton are some sort of package deal together. They were all going to Ole Miss. We told you on Friday it was a fairly easy news report to dismiss, and I think most of you did. But it still kind of conjured up this whole thing of somehow the Daniels thing, the Burton thing being connected, and they're going to go play together. And listen, I won't dispute the idea that everything I'm led to believe, Burton would have rather played with JT Daniels at quarterback. I won't dispute that here. That may have been what he wanted. However, the one thing I will dispute is the idea, well, then Georgia should have done that if that's what receivers like Jermaine Burton want. That's one of the things I will dispute here a little bit, because the actual facts of the situation for Georgia and its place in college football compared to all of this stuff with wide receivers, I still think is just kind of incredibly misunderstood here. The notion that somehow Jermaine Burton would have had a lot better season had JT Daniels been at quarterback, and somehow Georgia could have improved upon winning the national championship somehow as well if it was the kind of team that focused more on wide receiver play and some of the gaudy stats that a program like Alabama has admittedly gotten really good at producing, that somehow things would have been better for Georgia if that was true. And I just don't think the numbers kind of bear that out very well. In fact, let me kind of give you this. That if you look at the two games this year in which JT Daniels played in and threw the ball the most, the Clemson game, the South Carolina game, in 2021, those were games in which JT Daniels exceeded 30 passing attempts. That was sort of the most of JT Daniels we saw all year long. The idea was, well, in a situation like that, that's where Jermaine Burton's going to thrive. But the honest truth is, even in those games, even when Georgia had JT Daniels at quarterback, even when Georgia was throwing the ball more than it did once Daniels went to the bench and Stetson Bennett started playing, Daniels was still throwing to Brock Bowers more than he was throwing to Jermaine Burton. This whole idea that Georgia's fixation on Brock Bowers was somehow because Stetson Bennett was a deficient quarterback and that was the only guy somehow Bennett could throw to. In the Clemson game, Jermaine Burton only had 2 catches, Brock Bowers had 6. In the South Carolina game, Burton only had 3 catches, Brock Bowers had 5. That even JT Daniels was throwing the ball more to Brock Bowers than he was to Jermaine Burton, because let's just be adults here for a moment. Jermaine Burton is not as good a player as Brock Bowers is. So the idea that somehow, Burton should be getting Brock Bowers type productivity, Brock Bowers type touches, if he was as good as Brock Bowers, he would be, but Jermaine Burton's just not as good as Brock Bowers, and nobody should think that he is. Even JT Daniels was throwing more to Bowers than he's throwing to Burton. And then furthermore, beyond that, this whole idea of, well, Daniels and Burton would have been better for Georgia all the way around, that an offense that passes the ball more, the kind of thing where a Burton could thrive, somehow that would be better for Georgia all the way around. Once again, I don't know that the numbers actually argue for that as much as some people think they would. We already showed you a moment ago that more of JT Daniels did not necessarily mean more of Burton. Now, he did have the big game against Mississippi State in 2020. Nobody can dispute that. But in the 2021 season, when Brock Bowers was also an option, Daniels threw more to Bowers there as well. But if you want to look at those two games from this season, the South Carolina game, the Clemson game, if you want to go back and look at the two games from a year ago, in which Daniels also exceeded 30 passing attempts, the sort of record-setting day against Mississippi State, the bowl game against Cincinnati, these were games in which indisputably Georgia threw the ball more than they typically throw with Stetson Bennett. But here's one of the points that I just don't quite know that people have fully appreciated as much as they probably should. That when Georgia has thrown the ball more, and that's usually been games which JT Daniels played, when Georgia has thrown the ball more, they have not necessarily scored more points for doing so. In the 4 games in which JT Daniels in his Georgia career had 30 or more passing attempts, do you know that Georgia only averaged 26 points per game in those 4 contests? It's 31 against Mississippi State. It's 24 against Cincinnati. It's 10 against Clemson, although the touchdown was a defensive score. We'll still count it. It's 10 against Clemson, and then it was 40 against South Carolina. In So basically of the 4 games in which Daniels had 30 or more passing attempts, Georgia only exceeded 30 points in 2 of those games, only averaged 26 points over the course of the 4. That there is no doubt that Georgia threw the ball more when JT Daniels was quarterback, and guys like Jermaine Burton did seem to enjoy that better. But if we stipulate for a moment that what's best for Georgia is what's best, the actual data does not necessarily suggest that throwing the ball more was going to serve Georgia very well. If anything, the average offensive output actually went down the more that Georgia threw the football. And then beyond that, there's this. Let's make the comparison now to what's happening there at the University of Alabama. Because the one thing that cannot be argued with, I'll be happy to concede this point, that Alabama has become a far better passing team than Georgia has. Far better passing team than Georgia has. Bryce Young right now, Mac Jones the year before that, Tua Tagovailoa the year before that, that in the last, 4 years, Alabama has unlocked a level of passing achievement that Georgia has not come close to matching. Now, I do believe that Georgia's trying a little harder than some of y'all assume to kind of get there, but the truth is the gap between Georgia and Alabama when it comes to throwing the football is a very wide chasm. It just is. And Nick Saban, every time he gets a chance to pat himself on the back for that, boy, he is so proud to be able to do that. I've played this audio for you before, but let me go back and kind of give it to you again. This whole notion that Nick Saban thinks he's some sort of genius because he figured out that football was evolving and that anybody else that didn't notice that to the degree that he did is just simply not as smart as he is. Let's go back to the beginning of last year where Nick Saban really drove home this point. You've heard this before, but let's use it as a reminder.
The game is different now. People score fast. I grew up with the idea that you play good defense, you run the ball, you control vertical field position on special teams, and you're going to win. Whoever rushes the ball the most for the most yards is going to win the game. You're not going to win anything now doing that. Because A, the way the spread is, the way the rules are to run RPOs, the way the rules are that you can block downfield and throw the ball behind the line of scrimmage, those rules have changed college football. All right, and no huddle fastball has changed college football. So I changed my philosophy about 5 or 6 years ago. All right, and it was more than that. When Lane came here, we said we got to outscore him.
So listen, Nick Saban obviously pats himself on the back because he thinks he unlocked some sort of secret to college football. But I do not think it has been fully appreciated just how wrong what Nick Saban said has turned out to be. And a lot of you who are frankly worried that a guy like Burton would leave Georgia to go to Alabama because it's a better passing team, a lot of you, I don't think, have fully appreciated just how incorrect Saban's assessment of the sport is right there. And some of you, if you had your way, if you were Kirby Smart's boss, you would tell him, you got to listen to Saban right there. You've got to change to become more like Alabama because Nick Saban's figured this college football thing out because guys like Jermaine Burton want to be at Alabama instead of being at a place like Georgia. But let me just give you a number here that kind of explains just how wrong all of this is. And frankly, I'm not even quite so sure Nick Saban realizes just how much he overestimated the degree to which college football has kind of changed. Let's go back and look at the period. I'm going to read off a couple of notes here for a second. From 2009 to 2017, that is a 9-year period. Over the course of that 9-year period, from 2009 to 2017, Alabama won more than half of the national championships. They won 5 of the 9 titles over the course of that span, 2009, 2011, 2012, 2015, and 2017. Over the course of those 9 years, Alabama averaged 36 points per game. Now, in 2018, Alabama exceeded 40-plus points per game for the first time. And they've essentially been at or better than 40-plus points per game per season over the course of the last 4 years. From 2018 through 2021, Alabama has averaged 45 points per game. But in the 4 years in which Alabama has been averaging 45 points per game, they've only won 1 national championship. This number is hiding in plain sight for everybody to see. That the Bama team that was scoring 36 points per game was winning national championships more than half the time. The Bama team that's scoring 45 points per game has won 1 of the last 4 national championships. Frankly, when you look over the course of that 4-year span, they've won the same number of national championships that Georgia has. This idea that Alabama as a program has some sort of insurmountable lead over UGA as a program. End-of-season results right now don't necessarily suggest that's true. They've each won the same number of national championships over the course of the last 4 years, including Georgia now as the reigning national champion in this sport. Now, if you look at what has beaten Alabama in 2 of those 4, obviously Georgia this past year, other than that, it's Trevor Lawrence, future number 1 overall pick. It's Joe Burrow, future number 1 overall pick. And you'll come back and say, well, BA, that just goes to show you got to have a future number 1 overall pick as your quarterback. And I would respond to you back there by saying, that's a little bit like saying you've got to depend on winning the lottery as a part of your retirement plan. That, of course, you'd like to have the number 1 overall draft pick at quarterback playing for your team. But frankly, I'd be embarrassed, to hear people say what I used to say about a guy like, say, Josh Allen, who's the quarterback for the Buffalo Bills now. And, Patrick Mahomes, what he's doing there, at Kansas City was at least somewhat unpredictable for some people there as well. No one would have, furthermore, known that Joe Burrow had the look of a future NFL draft, number 1 overall pick when he was riding the pine, sitting on the bench at a place like Ohio State. That identifying the future number 1 overall draft pick is simply not as easy as you might think. So your recipe for success has got to be about more than that. It's got to be about the kind of thing that Kirby Smart's cultivated here at UGA. Now, all of this is not said to somehow dismiss the notion that Georgia needs to be as good at wide receiver as it is at all the other position groups there as well. Eventually, that'd be nice. But there are a lot of people who seem to think that Alabama is better at Georgia just because in their mind, Georgia's not playing as entertaining a brand of football as what Alabama's playing. I think the actual overall numbers scream just how untrue that really is. That Alabama's embrace of, as Nick Saban calls it, fastball offense has actually caused Alabama to win less at the national championship level than it was before. And other teams who are really good at this, like Ohio State and Oklahoma, they're not sniffing national championships at all. So you can be more like Alabama. You can be more fun to watch for the Instagram highlight crowd, and you can be more attractive for wide receivers. But that's not necessarily going to make you better on the field. That the recipe for winning, I would say right now, actually rests a little bit more with what Kirby Smart did at UGA this year. That it's still a sport about 22 players, 11 on offense, 11 on defense. It's about playing complementary football on both sides of the ball. That's actually the recipe for national championship success that worked for Georgia this year. That making the entirety of your program about throwing and catching the football to the point where your defense suffers and your running game suffers and everything else suffers. For Alabama over the course of the last 4 years, if you're truly paying that close of attention, that's not working out quite as well as you might think. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Good morning to you, and thanks for being with us. Of course, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Glad to have you with us, whether it's 9:45 on our 1st and 15, DawgNation.com, the DawgNation app, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. We're on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and available as a podcast wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. Just really happy to have you with us, and really grateful to Pella Window and Door of Georgia for making it all possible. They're your source for energy-efficient windows and doors. And what that means is it has been freezing cold the last few days, especially at night, like down in the 20s. And obviously that means a lot of you kind of cranking up that heat and you're kind of getting that going inside the house. And it's important. You want to keep that energy where it's supposed to be. Heat, after all, I don't know that there's ever been a time where that's more expensive than it is right now. And so if you've got that big, expensive heating bill and you've got, that energy escaping out of your house because you've got, improperly sealed windows and doors, just inefficient windows and doors, that's a disaster, right? So you want to trust Pella Window and Door of Georgia because not only does the product look great on the outside, improves the curb appeal of your home, which could improve the resale value, but also makes your home feel better on the inside because the energy, the heat staying where it needs to be. Can help out with your bills and everything else and just kind of make you feel like you're just living a more efficient life all the way around. That's when we love Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Also, according to a 2020 survey, did you know that among leading window brands, Pella was actually the most preferred window brand by homeowners in the Atlanta area. So folks know this brand. They know its value. They know what it represents, what it stands for. They know the hard work that goes to satisfy those who choose Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Another reason why we're proud to recommend them around here. So please make sure you check them out. Also, big savings. Between now and March 3rd, you can get 10% off your entire project or no payments, no interest for 12 months. All of that is really, really good. So a couple of ways to get in touch. How about online? PellaofGA.com/DawgNation. That's PellaofGA.com/DawgNation. Or give them a call, 678-638-1496. That's 678-638-1496. Pella Window and Door of Georgia is viewed to be the best. We're going to get John Stinchcomb here coming up in a moment. We'll talk to him about the decision of Jermaine Burton leaving Bama, going to Georgia. Before that, I want to squeeze in and around the doghouse, assisted today by AAA. Now, I talked about this a moment ago, or at least I alluded to this a moment ago, that last night, watching the divisional round game between Buffalo and Kansas City, we're not really an NFL show here, but everybody was watching this game last night. It is quite possibly the best NFL game I've ever seen. And that's not exaggerating. Many of you feel the same way. Our producer, Michael Carville, says he does there as well. It's kind of funny. It's so good that it completely obscures the game before that, which Tom Brady led his team back from 27-3 to tie the game, then to lose at the very end. And today, almost everyone will be talking about Buffalo, Kansas City, even though the Tampa-LA game was remarkable in its own right. That's how good that it was. But as I was watching that game conclude last night, and as it ended, there was a narrative I was pretty sure was going to emerge from all of that, which I thought was going to be incorrect, and things are pretty much playing out exactly as I assumed they would. Let me show you this tweet on the screen as an example of this. Stuart Mandel, national college football writer, and weighing in on the actions of last night between Kansas City and Buffalo, here's what Stuart says on Twitter. This representative of a handful of other folks' thoughts. Stuart says, "My goodness, NFL football got way more exciting when it went full Big 12. In other words, what you saw last night, especially at the end with Mahomes and Allen going back and forth against each other, that was the kind of thing we've kind of come to expect from, like, say, the Big 12, one of these, pillow fight, 7-on-7 style college football games. Very little defense, it seemed, at the end of that Kansas City-Buffalo game. And listen, there is no doubt the duel between Allen and Mahomes was as good a battle in a short window like that as I've ever seen between two quarterbacks. It was fairly obvious that whichever quarterback had the ball in his hand was going to lead a scoring drive. It's one of the reasons why people get so frustrated about the fact that Buffalo loses the coin flip, then doesn't get the ball in overtime, because it was pretty obvious that if Allen had it in his hand, he was going to lead a scoring drive, as he had been at the end of regulation there. There's just no doubt those two quarterbacks played phenomenal. But there were 4 games played this weekend. And the one thing that people should not lose sight of is, while the Mahomes-Allen battle will be the most memorable, that is not necessarily what the sum total of this weekend was. If anything, prior to Mahomes and Allen, the through line for the other 3 games was really the way in which quarterbacks were trying to handle the dominant pass rush that was coming their way. How many times did Joe Burrow get sacked in Nashville? Like 9 times, ultimately. I believe that's a playoff record. Ultimately, Cincinnati wins the game, but deficiencies along the Bengals' offensive line was the story of that game. And, obviously Tennessee couldn't, manage the opportunity created by that. But pass rush was the story of Bengals Titans. The same thing for, like, say, Rams and Bucks. Ultimately, it's a 27-3 lead for LA that gets squandered. But the reason why the Rams ultimately won the game was certainly aided in part by the fact that they were at one point in time up 27-3. They get off to a fast start. Tampa Bay does not. It's the pass rush of guys like, say, Von Miller and the rest of that crew for the Rams that obviously create the opportunity that holds the Tampa Bay offense at bay, and then gives them a chance to ultimately hold on for the win. Matthew Stafford deservedly is going to get a lot of the credit for the end-of-game performance, but it was actually the performance of the Rams' defense that set the tone that leads to the Tampa victory. You'll see the same thing about San Francisco going on the road and knocking off Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers. The performance of the 49ers defense is what makes that possible. So let's not get obscured here in terms of what actually mattered in football this weekend. Mahomes versus Allen was the best show. And if you've got a Mahomes at quarterback or if you've got an Allen at quarterback, you're feeling pretty good about yourself. But frankly, it's not always easy to predict who's going to become the Mahomes, who's going to become the Allen. As I said a moment ago, there are a lot of people who incorrectly predicted those guys' future there at the time. That even at the NFL level, defense still matters. And frankly, it matters a lot, because for as good as Mahomes was last night and leading the Chiefs to victory, he also got, bludgeoned in the Super Bowl a year ago, and that's why Tampa won and Kansas City lost. And obviously the carryover back to the college football game is very important here. In fact, The way in which people get so fixated on the Mahomes-Allen battle at the expense of really paying attention to what truly mattered in the NFL this weekend, the same thing happens in college football there as well. People have a tendency just to have a huge bias in favor of offense. They just sort of like the Alabama style better, and they think that's what everyone should adopt, even though what Georgia did this year worked better for it than what Alabama has had going for it for most of the last 4 years there as well. Very interesting to watch that play out. A narrative that's not as much supported by facts as some people might think. That is Around the Doghouse, and it is assisted today by our friends at AAA. Of course, you can find AAA for legendary roadside assistance, even helping you save money on hotel rooms, things like that. My family, we always lean on AAA for that. But I also want you to know AAA as well when it comes to your auto insurance. As I said before, it seems like bills, things like that, are just more expensive than they've ever been. So anything you can do to save money, put more money back in your pocket, it's the kind of thing that you should do. That's why I want you to consider AAA for your auto insurance. When you go to the website, AAA.com/auto insurance, that's AAA.com/auto insurance. When you take a look at there, you're going to find out all the ways in which you can switch and save with AAA, and the fact that it has a very good chance of putting hundreds of dollars back in your pocket for doing so. That's money that matters. And in this day and age, everything you can do to put more money in your pocket is something that you should do. So think about AAA.com/auto insurance for all of that. You can also dial this phone number there too. It's 866-380-1637. That's 866-380-1637. AAA presenting Around the Doghouse to us here today, also saving you money when it comes to your auto insurance. So we're not done on the subject of Georgia and its wide receivers. We'll talk more about that coming up in a moment, about kind of what's left for Georgia, the wide receiver spot, how you move on from that. Also, Jermaine Burton was not the only former Dog to announce a transfer home over the course of the weekend. Another guy staying in the SEC. We will tell you about that there as well. But for the moment, on everything that's kind of going on here with what it means that Burton leaves Georgia to go to the team that Georgia just beat for the national championship, the landscape of college football, how all of this is being impacted by transfer portal, and the just continued battle between Kirby and Saban to be on top of the college football world. Let's cover all of that right now with John Stinchcomb as a part of a Classic City Lager Insider Update.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Let's say hello to John Stinchcomb, Classic City Lager Insider Update. John, I'm curious of your opinion on all of this. Obviously a big news day when Jermaine Burton, he'd already announced his intentions to enter the transfer portal last week, but now we know he's going to Alabama. This is Georgia's arch nemesis. This is the team that Georgia just beat for a national championship after striving for years to get to that point. What's your immediate reaction when you hear that Burton's going to go play for the other guy?
Well, it makes sense for Burton. I mean, you look at the history of transfer wide receivers and the prolific offense that Alabama has with Bryce Young and the ability to get the ball downfield. You look at the transfer from Jamison Williams last year from Ohio State and the opportunities that he found in Alabama, and you can draw some strong correlations as to why Burton wants to transfer to Alabama. It's a storied program, still at the top of the heap, and I think what fans have to recognize is this is the nature of college football now. And like it or not, NILs and transfer portals have changed the game. There is free agency in college sports, and players are looking for the best opportunities for their individual success. And you look at Jermaine and you realize that at Georgia, he's coming back as arguably the number one wide receiver on the roster. He was going to get, I would think, the lion's share of the touches to wide receivers outside of a tight end, but yet still wanted to seek greener pastures. And I think that's what college football has become, whether you like it or not, whether the intentions of the transfer portal were for this type scenario to play out. It is what it is. And Georgia is going to get their players as well. What is there, 1,500-plus players in the transfer portal? And you're going to see guys just, it's musical chairs right now. They're going to pick and choose the opportunities that fit them best. And right now, Georgia has seen more walk out of the door than walk in this year. But I think we're pretty appreciative for guys like Kendrick that found a home in Athens this past season, and what a difference he made. So we're going to win some, we're going to lose some, and today we lost a good one.
So let me kind of walk through a lot of these issues because I think you're raising a couple of very good points. Let me start with this, and you touched on this. Clearly, Alabama's a better passing team than Georgia's. There's zero dispute about that. The numbers speak for themselves about how prolific Alabama has become as a passing attack. They do very closely resemble like a lot of what we used to think of as sort of Big 12 football. But, John, the one point I'm trying to hammer home is that for the Georgia fan who thinks that's the problem, that somehow Alabama has exceeded Georgia as a passing team, it is not obvious in the years in which Alabama has kind of taken this step forward, throwing the football, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, it is not obvious that they are winning more because of the change that they have made. Furthermore, had Georgia thrown the ball more this year, it's not obvious they would be reigning national champion. That somehow, Alabama's become the superior passing team, but at least for 2021, that has not made it a superior team in comparison to Georgia. And somehow I think some of that is getting lost in all of this.
Well, you're talking about two different issues. You're talking about, one, what's good for me as an individual. So as a wide receiver, will my stats look better? Could I have gaudier numbers when we throw the ball around more? Yeah, absolutely. Does that translate into wins? No, absolutely not. There's not a direct corollary there. I think you have to be able to score points. I think that's a given in the way the game is played this year, especially in big-time matchups. But if Georgia 2021 version proves anything, that defense is important. I heard the piece right before I hopped on the air of the difference a pass rush makes, and impacting a passer is, I would say, equally as important as not having busts on the back end. I mean, despite, you look at Cincinnati game, and despite having 9 sacks, allowing 9 sacks, the back end is where the issue was, and there's a lot of big plays made in that game, along with some others. I mean, you mentioned the Mahomes-Allen matchup, and without a prevent defense that allows a Travis Kelce to run down the field unabated and put them in field goal range to send the game into overtime, those type plays don't happen. So, yes, you want to be able to put up numbers and score offensively, and that's good for your team, but defense most certainly is not dead. And I think this Georgia team is your case in point for that. That good defense, solid defense is still very much alive and needed in this sport, and it's not, there's only one recipe for success. Georgia's recipe was not, we're going to put up gaudy numbers. It's, we're going to prevent you from doing what you want to do offensively and complement that with a balanced attack. It wasn't solely run game. It wasn't the 1980s version of Georgia football. There was a wide variety of ways that Georgia's offense attacked a defense in ways that we haven't seen in recent history. But it's still a play-action, balanced run approach that is complemented by an aerial attack from Georgia's offense.
So as far as the idea now of just a player transferring from one team to the other, let's talk about the impact of the transfer portal on the sport right now. This is obviously very new for college football, but it's really not that new for sports in general. For instance, going back to a time when you and I were kids, John, in the 1990s, Deion Sanders won a Super Bowl for San Francisco, beating Dallas in the NFC title game. Then the next year went to Dallas and beat San Francisco in the title game. He essentially flipped teams and flipped the championship by doing so. And the NFL's popularity didn't suffer because of that. I'm willing to admit all of that, that the notion of professional athletes changing teams has been the kind of thing that you and I have lived with for the entirety of our lifetime, including going to rivals and going to, competitors and everything else. So when it comes to the way in which the transfer portal in particular is impacting this competition that's ongoing between Georgia and Alabama, now that a big-time Georgia player is going to be playing for Alabama, tell me a little bit more about your thoughts about that part of this in particular.
Well, I can't wait to see how this continues to evolve. Holy cow, I'm watching a coyote run across my yard. You don't see this every day, PA.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah,
I thought they were nocturnal.
My dog,
I thought they were nocturnal animals. Actually, that's kind of scary. I thought they were nocturnal.
That is. Well, nope, this one's just jogging right across. How about that?
Well, please be careful.
Totally off topic. Forgive me, B.A.
No worries.
That is wild. I don't even know where we were. Oh, so the difference is, and what we'll have to see and how this plays out in college is, in the NFL, there's free agency, and there's also some commitment and buy-in that a player makes back to their team. I mean, they're locked in for at least a certain amount of time because there's a contract. Right now, that doesn't exist. Right now, there is no contract that a player has to honor with their school. If they want to transfer after a year, after 2 years, after 3, it does not matter. They can do that freely once. Now, they have to have the talent to be considered to be added to that roster for whatever team they're going to. But, we're talking about, in this specific conversation, we're talking about players with the ability that most teams would want, that you put your name in the portal, and now you've got the opportunity to be a free agent and have coaches from Ole Miss fly into town to recruit you again.
Yeah.
And that's the big difference between NFL free agency and what we're seeing in college sports is the powers have shifted, and it's solely on, I'll say exclusively almost, on the side of the player, where I can get paid like I'm a professional athlete. I can pick and choose which team I want to go to in ways that you could not do as a professional athlete. So I'll be really interested to see what these next steps are and how you go about addressing the fact that there's an imbalance. We have created an imbalance with NILs and transfer portals where, you're going to see these pooling of really talented players. And, I read an article about, was it Lincoln Riley when he goes to USC? What would prevent him from cherry picking and pulling his entire team from Oklahoma, or at least the guys that would be, that you'd want, and having them transfer to USC? I mean, it's not without merit that would be a possibility that probably wasn't considered when we first considered this transfer portal and what it might provide for players. But it's something that would certainly be a factor and a possibility that might even be realized in the near future.
Yeah, Nick Saban kind of alluded to this in the joint press conference he did with Kirby Smart before the national championship game, that, and I'm going to paraphrase what Saban said here, and we'll probably get more into this topic, obviously, over the course of the offseason, but essentially you leverage NIL to try to reform the transfer portal stuff a little bit, because ultimately I don't really think coaches are bothered that much by NIL. I really don't. I think that, some maybe embrace it more than others, but ultimately I think the thing that is ruining the sport right now is actually, that's probably overstating things a bit, but the biggest problem for the sport right now is not NIL, it's transfer portal. And maybe you do, leverage some of the revenue opportunities for players to also kind of put some contractual boundaries around the idea of, you come here, we're going to ask for this commitment for X number of years, whether it's 2 years or 3 years or whatever else, that there has to be some sort of sanity kind of pumped back into the system a little bit, because right now there's just simply not enough of it.
Well, I think Saban, he's warned us. He's warned really the rest of college football and college athletics, and said, this isn't what you want. This isn't good for players. It's not good for our sport. Now, if you allow it, I'm going to do it better than anybody else. Now, I don't think you should. I don't think it's good for us. But if this is going to happen, then, my God, we're going to do it really well. And they have. And what you see is guys like Jamison Williams and Jermaine Burton that you can pull from other programs and put on your roster. And is that good for sports? I don't think so. Is that good for other programs? Nope. But I don't blame in the least Nick Saban. He has said before the transfer portal was allowed and since it's allowed, this isn't good. But if you're gonna allow it, we're going to maximize it, and they have. The ability for programs, and not just those that are on staff, but Texas A&M is a great case study where they're openly saying we've committed $25+ million to make sure we have the players that we want here. And then you look at the Alabamas where you can transfer guys in. It's totally changed the game. What's the importance of a scholarship of, what's the annual value of that? $25,000? Well, if I can get you an NIL deal that exceeds that amount, do I even need to have you on scholarship? Can I expand my roster from 85 guys on scholarship, or can it be 100? Can I have 100 players to pull from because, you may be a preferred walk-on, but you might get even more than a guy that signed a scholarship. So, the landscape of college athletics, primarily college football, is so different and is evolving into a space that no one knows how to manage right now. And other shoes are going to have to drop. I don't think this is a sustainable model. It doesn't make sense. I think there's going to be frustration on fans' parts and school parts as well, that they've invested in these kids. You bring them to campus, which, requires a commitment from the school to make them a part of, your campus, your program, and they can freely leave at any given moment, despite the investment that you've made. And, for fans, they're going, this just doesn't feel right. I want to commit to my team, and I want the guys on it to commit back to it. And that certainly doesn't exist at the level that we've grown accustomed to. And, we're going to have to evolve as fans as well. But I think there's other shoes that need to drop for this whole dynamic to make sense.
We're squeezing one final question for you in a minute, John. Let me remind folks before that, though, this is our Classic City Lager Insider Update with John Stinchcomb. And, of course, some things in college football get more complicated seemingly by the day. That's why when we can enjoy simple things, that's what I want to lean into and do. And this weekend I had myself some Classic City Lager as I was watching some of those pro football games. I know many of you did the same thing because it's just good cold beer. Nice and simple. Easy as that. Good cold beer. It's a lager-style beer, lighter in color, but listen, no sacrifice on flavor. It's the kind of craft-style lager, frankly, you would expect from a brewery like Creature Comforts Brewing Company. And we were in Athens a couple of weeks ago. I had a chance to enjoy some there. I took some home with me when we were at the Creature Comforts brew house there in downtown Athens. But you don't have to be in Athens to get it. Wherever you're doing your shopping, this is one of those craft lagers that's available all year long. Wherever you're doing your shopping, you can pick it up. 6 and 12-pack cans. The can feels so good and cold in your hand. Looks good. It's just a really great experience. So check out some Classic City Lager from Creature Comforts Brewing Company today. It is just good cold beer. So, John, all of this is now to kind of lead us to this point, which is, while I may kind of roll my eyes at people who think that, somehow Georgia's deficient because it's not playing Big 12 football the way the other teams are, the fact of the matter is it would be nice if Georgia raised the level of performance from its wide receiver room a bit to match a little bit more of what's happening for some of the other position groups. You saw a big-time pass-catching target emerge this year in Brock Bowers, and finding someone to kind of replicate that from the wide receiver room, at least come close to that, I do think it's pretty important. Later on in the show, I'm going to kind of talk about some of the guys I think that might be, but I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, okay, finding somebody to really emerge from that wide receiver room is an important task for Georgia in 2022. Had Burton stayed, he'd have a chance to be that guy. Figuring out who it can be is a pretty important offseason task for Georgia.
Yes, and you look at the way Georgia deployed their receivers this year and really in recent history, especially under Monken. They're going to rotate a number of guys through. It's not going to be 3 guys you see consistently all game long. I just think of the personnel groupings that we saw this year where, it'd be A.D. Mitchell and McConkey and, Bowers and Darnell and Fitzpatrick, and all of a sudden you've rolled in, Jermaine Burton and Pickens towards the end of the year once he got healthy. It's going to be a platoon of wide receivers. With that said, you got to have guys that you trust and that you can believe in once they get out there that can make plays. You don't want defenses keying in on Brock Bowers because he's on everyone's radar at this point. And the more weapons that you can have, especially to stretch a field and create both horizontal and vertical separation and opportunities for one another. That's a necessity, and we had that this year in ways that I don't think anyone expected Bowers to come in and play the way he did, and it drew some attention away from some of the other receivers. And now the question is, heading into this season, this 2022 season, who are those guys? Obviously, A.D. Mitchell is able to make big-time plays in big-time moments, and now it's a matter of consistency for him and a healthy Don Blaylock. And there's a number of guys in that position group room that you think have the potential to kind of step up and answer that call. But it's, time will tell as to which guys really sift through and come to the forefront.
John, great stuff. Thank you for being here as part of our Classic City Logger Insider Update today. Your insight's always very valuable for us. Hope you have a great week. Be careful with those coyotes out there, and we'll look forward to speaking to you soon.
That kind of shook me up a little bit, B.A., no doubt.
No doubt
I'm out
about
here with
that.
my dog and watch a coyote run across the yard.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. Well, you be careful, and I guess say hello to the Roadrunner for us, too, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon.
Will do. Go Dogs.
Yes, sir.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, we'll talk more about the wide receiver situation in general for Georgia kind of coming up in a moment about what needs to happen for that group here in 2022. Before that, though, let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of our friends, obviously, at Royal Caribbean. We love what Royal Caribbean does for us here around here. Getting ready for a great year in 2022 on those seas with those Royal Caribbean cruise ships. Always fun stuff. Obviously, whether it be Perfect Day Coco Cay, that private island right there in the Bahamas. I know my wife's excited about being on a Royal Caribbean cruise there as well. She was kind of playing around the internet the other day, looking at all the cool stuff that happens on Coco Cay, Perfect Day Coco Cay with Royal Caribbean. And you see the thrill side, which you got the tallest water slide basically, in North America. You got largest freshwater pool in the Bahamas. You've got, all kinds of stuff, a helium balloon that takes you several hundred feet in the air. All of that's just really cool. And then on the other side, which is probably a little bit more my speed, you have the chill side, these private floating cabanas that you can enjoy and relax and just really make the most of your vacation. This is what Royal Caribbean's doing. They're really setting a new standard for the way in which you entertain yourself on board one of their ships, and some of that is a lot of these itineraries taking you to Perfect Day Coco Cay. So what an amazing time to be on a Royal Caribbean cruise ship. So much fun here in 2022. And obviously, when we recommend Royal Caribbean, we also recommend our friends at the Cruise and Vacation Authority because they know all about those Royal Caribbean cruise ships and how you can make the experience the best for you. Check them out online, the Cruise and Vacation Authority, tcava.com, tcava.com, or give them a call, 770-952-8300. That's 770-952-8300. Let them tell you everything you have in store for you there. So we talked Jermaine Burton a good bit going to Alabama. Another dog has also found himself a new home as well. That is Latavius Brini, who's on his way to play for Sam Pittman and Arkansas. Brini giving you the Wool Pig Suey and obviously the graphic there in the Arkansas jersey. And listen, it is totally true that the reaction that most Georgia fans have with Brini going to Arkansas is different than Burton going to Alabama. And I don't think anyone needs to make any kind of apology for that whatsoever. Brini, for whatever reason, we may not ever fully know this, just kind of lost his spot there at UGA. Coach's decision. They chose late in the year to go William Poole over Brini. Didn't work out so well in the SEC championship game. Seemed to work out pretty well in the national championship game. Brini, who had been at Georgia since 2017, just seemed to kind of fall out of favor. He's got one more shot to play. Of course he wants to go somewhere where he feels like he's going to have a chance to play. And yes, admittedly, Georgia fans also like Sam Pittman way more than they like Nick Saban. And so therefore, going to help Pittman's the kind of thing that most Georgia fans don't really mind too much. Arkansas is not on Georgia's schedule for this upcoming season. This is, in the eyes of most Georgia fans, a safe transfer destination in a world in which, as I said off the top of the program, most fans derive entertainment from college football through the competition that Georgia has with other schools. This is the kind of thing that fans feel okay about. Burton, who was in line for a lot of playing time at Georgia next season, not going to a school that's way away from Georgia's orbit, but going to the team that Georgia played twice in the last 3 games of this past season, that is just going to feel different to most people. I don't think there's any need to apologize for that whatsoever. I also think it's interesting that we really have kind of two categories of programs that seem to utilize the portal pretty well. Obviously, in the case of Saban, it's an example of the rich getting richer, and that's, kind of what Nick Saban has warned us about. Kirby Smart's warned us about that a little bit too, and that's exactly what seems to be happening there in the case of Burton or Jahmyr Gibbs, players like that going to Alabama. But there is also a category of coach who maybe doesn't have the most fertile recruiting soil to pull from, maybe inherited kind of a mess when they first took the job, and they've really utilized the portal pretty well as a way of building a roster that can be competitive. And it's ironic, I guess, that a couple of the guys that do that as well as anybody are actually former Georgia assistants. Mel Tucker at Michigan State. The situation that Tucker inherited at East Lansing was not very favorable. And yet, last year, Michigan State was a contender for the Big Ten East because of a lot of the transfer players that the program brought in. And Tucker continues to do some of that kind of stuff right now. Same thing for Pittman there, too. Arkansas has certainly tried to recruit Texas over the years. It tries to get into Louisiana when it can. Arkansas is actually trying to be a little bit of a factor in the state of Georgia when it comes to recruiting under Pittman, too. But for the most part, it really can't recruit its home state very well. It's just not a very deep state for high school football talent. So if you want a competitive roster, you've got to be creative about how you put that together. And one of the areas of creativity that Pittman has shown is that ability to massage the transfer portal to his advantage. In a case like this, obviously, probably knows a little bit about Latavius Brini, so you kind of bring him in there. So the reaction of Georgia fans on that is just going to be far different than Burton going to Alabama. By the way, speaking of Georgia fan reaction, the thing that I probably pre-Burton got the most social media messages about here this weekend was the very odd titles that Billy Napier is giving support staff guys and staffers on his new team, including Chris Couch here, who is the game changer coordinator working with the special teams. And Reddit CFB had some fun with this, saying of all the titles to give a special teams coach, that certainly is one of them. This is goofy. It's corny. It's the kind of thing that Butch Jones would have done at Tennessee, that Jeff Collins would do at Georgia Tech, that maybe even Dan Mullen would have done a little bit of there at Florida. It's just really, really goofy. Georgia fans are having a great time with all of this, and you just can't expect – you just can't expect people not to kind of go in on something like that. And for a Billy Napier – who's supposed to be promising a little bit of a return to normalcy for Florida, this sort of feels like some of the corny stuff that they've been guilty of in the past. I'd say be very, very careful there on all of that. We'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of our friends at Royal Caribbean. Now, let's talk Georgian wide receivers here just for a moment, because while I am more than happy to tell you, I think there is a recent misunderstanding of the degree to which strong wide receiver play correlates with winning at the championship level. The numbers are overwhelmingly in favor of my argument on that. And while I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding about how much Georgia fans assume that throwing the ball more would even contribute to winning on this team itself, once again, I think the numbers back me up pretty strongly on that too. It is still fair to point out that, hey, it'd be kind of nice if Georgia did evolve a little bit more at the wide receiver spot. I think that Georgia's been trying to do that. I think that Georgia's seeking out the very best quarterbacks that it can get, including Arch Manning for the class of 2023. Gunnar Stockton recently arrived on campus. Guys like, Brock Vandegrift, Carson Beck for the future, whatever else, and trying to go after those top receivers there as well. It wanted to be a player for Evan Stewart. Stewart chose to go somewhere else. Wanted to be a player for Luther Burden. Burden chose to go somewhere else. That Georgia is certainly trying to be as effective in recruiting players for the passing game as it is for the other positions. In fact, this year was a step forward in that direction, because you can say, well, Brock Bowers only a tight end. Let me ask you an honest question. How many receivers in the SEC this past season do you think were better than Bowers? Not receivers in the Georgia roster. We know none of them are. How many receivers in the SEC across the league are better than Bowers? I'd say Jamison Williams might be, maybe Traylon Burks. After that, I think that Brock Bowers may be the third best wide receiver in the SEC, maybe even second best wide receiver in the SEC, despite the fact that he's only, in the eyes of some, a tight end. So this season was a big step forward for Georgia when it comes to throwing the football, but for some fans, they, in a fair and honest way, want to see Georgia continue to evolve with that there as well. So you're going to go back to signing day, the December version of that, when Georgia brought in some receivers for the 2022 class. Kirby kind of addressed this, of what Georgia's bringing in and the challenge that Georgia has in terms of filling out all the numbers related to that position group. In light of what's happened now with Burton on the move, Justin Robinson also at Mississippi State now, let's hear Kirby Smart on the subject of wide receiver depth going back to December.
Well, I think it starts with speed. You got to have vertical speed down the field, and we feel like we've got some guys that can really stretch the field and do that. High character. You got to be able to learn. You got to be able to buy into the offense, the understand the splits, understand the route tree, understand all the things, the intricacies that go into playing the position. And we got a really good group there. I think each one of those guys that we've been able to bring on board brings a different attribute, whether it's excellent speed, excellent size, quickness, toughness, all those things you look for. And in wideout is another position that when you look across the board, we're down. We were down all year, not just because of injury. We were just down because we had 3 or 4 leave. And now we're trying to replace all those guys and play catch up. And that's tough to do in our league. I like to have the numbers where we kind of hit quota, and if you're finding out more and more now, it's easier to leave than it is to get them. So we got to get some more guys there.
I think everything that Smart says there is really fair. Obviously, as Smart said, you're going to have guys, he even predicted that back in December, that there would be an exodus from the program at that position, and you got to try to find a way to replenish that stock. So will Georgia be looking to one of its 2022 signees to do some of that? I think maybe so. I saw Denalyn Morissette play in person this year. I was very impressed. I saw Cole Spear play in person this year. I was very impressed. Think about like a Chandler Smith, who admittedly I probably learned more about more quickly at the end of the process, had to play catch up on him a little bit. He seems to bring some of that speed to the table here that's probably worth paying attention to. Will Georgia also eventually look to the transfer portal for a wide receiver? I believe it probably will. A couple of years ago, that worked out pretty well. Lawrence Cager, when he was healthy coming over from Miami, had a very good season for Georgia. Very dependable wide receiver. His overall statistical performance at Miami would actually not even suggest how good he turned out to be there at UGA for the most part. So I would say eventually we see Georgia go into the transfer portal to bring in a receiver. The exodus of Burton probably even increases the likelihood that's the case. But ultimately, this conversation kind of also becomes about the guys who have been on the roster and we expect to still be on the roster for this upcoming season. And we have conversations like this. One of the things I think is really important is I think we have to be as realistic as possible. Like across the board, Georgia's not going to have a bunch of Jamar Chases emerge or, a bunch of, Devontae Smiths emerge. That's probably asking a lot from what Georgia currently has in its wide receiver room. But given all the guys, whether it be transfer that you add, incoming freshmen that you're bringing in, or guys who have been here taking another step forward, is it unreasonable to say that one of those guys, from the 10 or 11 names that you could potentially add together here, could one of those guys take a major step forward and give you something similar to what Bowers gave you at the tight end position? Not totally matching those numbers, because that would frankly be very hard to do, but something approaching that. Something a little bit similar to what George Pickens did in a year in which Georgia didn't throw the ball very well at all in 2019. Could somebody do something close to that to go along with a Bowers? And how much more effective would the Georgia passing attack be if that were the case? For the team that's already the reigning national champion, that's a way that the program could seemingly get even better. And, frankly, you look at the young guys who showed out for you in the national championship game. Obviously, A.D. Mitchell being the guy who caught the final offensive touchdown of the game. You think about guys like, as John Stinchcomb alluded to, a Dominic Blaylock kind of coming back from injury. And, the other name that comes up here for me, it's one of the faces we showed on video there a moment ago. That the epicenter of all this conversation may be a player like Arian Smith, because he is the intersection of former big-time recruit. This was a top 10 wide receiver in the country. But he also has that thing that a lot of Georgia pass-catching targets really haven't had, which is the true blazing speed. When he's healthy, he's a world-class speedster. Now, though, when he's healthy, part of that sentence is doing an awful lot of work. I completely acknowledge that. But that becomes a really interesting player for me in the upcoming season of, can he healthy and can he stay healthy long enough to be a full-time participant and contributor during practice to really emerge and be the best possible version of himself? Because if he is healthy enough to be that guy, then no one really brings the speed to the table that Smith brings. We predicted good things for him before a few months ago, but ultimately injury prevents that from happening. So I'm going to try to be as realistic and reasonable with all of you as I possibly can be. I think one receiver emerging from the crop of guys who will be on this roster next season is actually a pretty big step forward for a team that's already got an elite pass-catching target in Brock Bowers. And I'm not going to go all in with my chips on any one player being that guy. Arian Smith does have my attention, and maybe we'll see this finally be the year that he kind of blossoms in that direction. One more quick shout out before we let you go. How about our friends at the Finish Long Drink? I love telling folks about things they don't already know about. And over the course of the last year or so, I've had a great time introducing the Finish Long Drink to people because it is the kind of thing that's actually only been in the United States of America for a couple of years. Prior to that, it was actually invented, I guess, not discovered. It was created for the first time in Helsinki back in the 1950s when the Summer Games were there for that. And so it's been popular in Europe for a long time. Been in America now the last couple of years, and in Georgia, and pretty much wherever you might be, you can find the Finish Long Drink if you know how to look for it. So the best thing I can tell you to do is go to thelongdrink.com, put in your zip code there, and it'll tell you where you can pick some up. There are 4 different varieties. There's the traditional, which has got like a gin kick with like a grapefruit flavor to go along with that. Long Drink Zero, 0 carbs, 0 sugar. Long Drink Strong, 8.5% alcohol by volume. Long Drink Cranberry, which obviously, as you would assume, has the nice cranberry flavor to go with the gin kick on all of that. It's really good. And you can actually get an 8-can variety pack that has 2 different cans of each of the 4 long drink varieties. So please make sure you check that out, thelongdrink.com, and find out where you can pick some up today. All right, so a few golden shoes to give out today, and a lot of this in relationship to dogs and the pros doing some pretty big things all the way around. Starting with the SEC Network having some fun with Matthew Stafford's win over former Wolverine Tom Brady. The SEC Network on Twitter saying Georgia just beat Michigan again. We talked last week about taking some time to appreciate the Orange Bowl. The SEC Network doing that on Twitter as the former dog Matthew Stafford beats the former Michigander Tom Brady. Pretty good stuff from the SEC Network. We'll give them a golden shoe. Also, Hudson Swafford. Been quite a start for the Dogs on Tour here in the PGA Tour so far this year. Hudson winning the American Express there in Palm Springs. Also, nice photo of his family there. Great job by the former UGA golfer Hudson Swafford winning on the PGA Tour. Then, admittedly, I don't know a ton about gymnastics, but Rachel Bauman got a perfect 10 here this weekend. So I am at least smart enough to know that's a very big deal. We'll give her a golden shoe there as well. So congratulations there. How about Gator Hater Updater? 4,764 days since those lousy, stinking Gators have won a national championship. What a sad drought that is. Reigning national champions, the Dogs, know nothing about that, but they do know about this. 278 days from right now, Georgia back in Jacksonville, beating Florida again, strutting in there as the national champs. Lousy, stinking Gators limping on home after it's all said and done. DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We'll see you again tomorrow. And on video. Time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric. You can trust R.S. Andrews to do all that for you. I talked about heating systems a little earlier. Listen, right now the thing that you need to make sure you're doing is making sure your heating system is actually keeping pace. I mean, I know we've had ours cranked up big time. Now, listen, I'm pretty hot-natured. My family not. That heating system's been working heavy lately. So a lot of you are kind of concerned that maybe that furnace is not going to make it through the rest of the winter. You've been told maybe even by some fly-by-night company that you got to get a new one. Listen, have the folks, have Darien and them come over and look at it for you. They're actually going to probably be able to tell you how you can get the current heating system you have tuned back up to factory fresh specs so you can actually get some new life out of that system that maybe is tired and, if we're honest, might be close to being on its last legs, but you don't need it replaced as of yet. R.S. Andrews can get it tuned back up for you. Factory fresh specs, and it just costs $99. Check them out online at rsandrews.com. Okay, so comments coming, and we'll do the Burton stuff, and we'll do everything else and what everybody else wants to do. So let me ask you this, and I'm not I was briefly monitoring the comments a little earlier. It sounds like Shelton had something. Shelton Tucker's a frequent commenter. Did I see this correctly? Did he have a tragedy in his life? Would somebody reach out to me about that? I don't know if y'all know Shelton personally or whatever else, but can somebody reach out to me and try to do it on Twitter or something if you can? I'd like to know more about that because, I mean, obviously we're impacted anytime somebody has it's one of those things where, like, I only saw this out of the corner of my eye and I didn't really see what it was. So please let me know what's going on here. because I saw that out of the corner of my eye. So Shelton Tucker, one of our regular commenters, it sounds like he had something happen in his life, and I want to make sure that we address that. Marcus Chafin telling me about this right now. This is awful. Peter Jeffrey Wilson, thank you for telling me. I just am so sorry. So sorry. I don't know if Shelton's still with us in the comment section or not, but if y'all know him personally, please pass on what I'm saying right now, and I mean this from the depths of my soul. I'm so sorry for his loss. I really am. I really, really am. For sure. So sorry. So we'll obviously address that with Shelton more on a personal level here, and awkwardly we'll try to kind of get into the conversation here. But listen, a lot of what we do here during this portion of the show is true personal interaction. Like the phrase I've always used is that I never wanted DawgNation to be two-dimensional. A website is flat. That's two-dimensional. It has width, it has, height, but there's very little depth to it. A lot of times you don't know who the writer is. And, when we started moving into the world of, like, say, podcasts and video, I never wanted DawgNation to be a flat two-dimensional thing. I always wanted you to feel like you knew me, and as much as I possibly can, even though there are a lot of you, I want to feel like I know some of you, that we do have that ability to kind of connect personally. Because ultimately, people don't need more news in their life. They need more connection in their life. That's the problem that DawgNation exists to solve. That there are already people covering the news, but people crave a sense of community. That's kind of what DawgNation's always hopefully been about. And so from that standpoint, while we may disagree on, college football topics or Georgia football topics, whatever else, ultimately the disagreement is still part of the bond that we have together. It's part of the community that we forge together. And so when somebody in this audience is hurting, man, we all hurt. When my dad died more than a year ago, I got thousands of messages from many of you. And I felt it. I felt that we were in community with each other throughout all of that. So that is a very important thing to me. And it's kind of awkward to kind of transition into the regular college football conversation. But when possible, it's important to kind of bring that up. That's kind of what we exist to talk about here. All right, let's see what else. So let's see. David West says Kirby's beat 2 Heisman winners in the college football playoff. And I don't think that should be discounted. I'm going to keep coming back to that over and over again. And this is a little bit of an evolution for me. I mean, here's the one thing that I joke all the time about being a blowhard that speaks into a microphone for a living, and I appreciate that. That's the way that some people are going to experience me. But hopefully, like, the one thing that I do is everything I've ever said is on the internet somewhere, archives, whatever else. If you want to go back a couple of years ago, I was the loudest one probably saying, hey, Georgia had to forget about all this defensive stuff and start, being more like Alabama, more like Oklahoma, more like Ohio State. But as new data comes in, opinions have a tendency to evolve. And more data is coming in here. And as I said during the regular show, the Alabama evolution has not worked as well as they think it has. At least I should hope they've noticed that in the era in which they were scoring 30-something points per game, they were winning national championships about 50% of the time, more than 50% of the time. In the era in which they're scoring 45 points per game, they've won 1 of the last 4. Their defense got torched twice in 2019, preventing them from being in the college football playoff. And their great offense got shut down twice against Georgia this season, against Clemson, that title game in 2018, that all of a sudden that great offense in a game in which it mattered the most just wasn't quite as dependable as maybe they thought it would be. Like, that is what's happening in football. That football is truly still about more than just quarterbacks and wide receivers. It really is. And that's why Georgia won the national championship. Let me go over to Alan McGovern says, so who is our transfer portal win going to be? Do we even need a transfer in? Alan, my guess is that Georgia it may have already been looking towards the transfer portal for a wide receiver. But I think the move of Jermaine Burton to Alabama even raises the likelihood that Georgia will go that direction. I do. I do. Now, I don't know who it is. I mean, let's be frank here for a moment. When Lawrence Cager transferred in a couple of years ago, Lawrence Cager was not very famous. That most of us follow college football pretty closely. I watch a lot of college football has nothing to do with Georgia and, frankly, nothing to do with the SEC. I'm an SEC homer. I don't mind telling you that, but I watch all kinds of college football. Even for someone like me who's a little bit of a college football obsessive, Cager wasn't even very famous to me, and yet if I told you could have a replica of Lawrence Cager on this team for this year, would you want it? I would say that most of you would probably say yes to that. So there is a chance that the guy that Georgia brings in, maybe it's a little bit like a Cager. Maybe it's a little bit like someone who's not immediately all that famous to you, but could be a valuable guy. Let me also say this here really quick. There's something else about Lawrence Cager that kind of already stood out to me there as well. We'll see if I can find this quickly. Hold on one second. Let's see if I can. Actually, I'll do this later on. It's going to take me too long to pull up. So, but yeah, the point is, I'm guessing that Georgia does go transfer portal. The name that comes back probably won't be as famous as a guy like Jermaine Burton, former big-time, top 100 player in the country type recruit. May not be quite so famous, but that doesn't mean that it's not a pretty good player. That's just kind of the way it goes. Kenesha Clark brings up a really good point. Kenesha says, even with the high-powered offense, Bama still barely beat Florida, Arkansas, Auburn, and LSU, and they lost Texas A&M. This is really true. Like, I think Georgia fans are more impressed with Alabama than Alabama fans are. I really do. Now, some of you are still bothered by some of those Alabama trolls in your life, but the perception that Georgia fans have of Alabama being this Garden of Eden of college football where everything is just always perfect all the time, I can promise you, as Kenesha points out, that is not the way Alabama fans speak about their own team. What do you think Alabama fans were saying about Pete Golding when Florida was shoving Alabama all over the field, running the ball down its throat? Did you go to an Alabama message board the week after that game? Because I did, and I can tell you this right now. Alabama fans at that point in time weren't patting themselves on the back for their Big 12 offense. They were wondering what happened to their SEC defense. It's just a fact. And by the way, as Kenesha pointed out, in the LSU game, Alabama scored 20 points. Offense wasn't exactly a juggernaut against Auburn either. That, this notion that this high-powered offense that Alabama admittedly has cultivated shows up at will and on command, not always. Kenesha is as right as anybody can be. That Alabama fans, I don't think, quite enjoyed their season this year as much as some Georgia fans seem to be impressed with it. I think that's probably pretty true. Let's go to YouTube. John Leggett says, what about Reed Gilbert at wide receiver? I am certainly hopeful that's the case. In the spirit of, as I said during the regular show, as realistic and reasonable as possible, I think I'm going to temper my expectations for Gilbert just because it has been a long road back to him towards football, and probably still a good bit of that journey is still left to come. But it's at least a possibility that you should keep in your mind. Michael Clayton said, for elite wide receivers, what is appealing about the UGA offense? No 1,000-yard wide receivers in 20 years. Bama has several. I don't dispute that at all. Georgia is not as appealing of a place for elite wide receivers as other programs are. And frankly, a lot of this predates Kirby Smart, that Georgia actually didn't recruit the wide receiver position very well for 10 years prior to Kirby getting here, at least 8 years, something along those lines. I don't dispute that at all. And it'd be nice if that changed, but I'm not that panicked about that. It's getting better, and frankly, it hasn't really proven to be all that much of a deterrent to winning a national championship because Georgia is the national champion. But what you're saying is factually true, that Georgia has a hard time with five-star wide receivers. They just don't really want to come to Georgia right now. That's not the kind of thing you can fix overnight. It's just not. It's just not. CB says, can we adjust the countdown to something national championship related? Well, in a way, the Gatorade updater is related to that because all of a sudden now Georgia gets to give it back to Florida. He says Florida just seems to be so petty to have for a countdown now that Georgia's the king. Yeah, I mean, listen, rivalries are still fun, and rivalry is still the bedrock and the foundation of what college football is built on. I appreciate your opinion, but from my perspective, the Florida stuff's going nowhere because you know why? Because a good Georgia fan is still a lousy, stinking Gator, and being national champion is going to be even more fun when you get a chance to rub it in the Florida fans' faces later on this year. DR says the Georgia OC is to blame. See, this is where, like, I get a little bit frustrated. The Georgia OC is to blame for what? Georgia's the national champion, and Georgia scored 40 points per game. Blame is the wrong word to use here. The Georgia offensive coordinator, whose name, by the way, is Todd Monken, should be lauded. He should be put on shoulders and paraded. I mean, literally, Monken should have come into Sanford Stadium a couple of weeks ago on the shoulders of Georgia. You know the way that Georgia used to kind of carry Vince Dooley around after big wins? Like, Todd Monken should get that treatment. See, like, I've talked about this a million times before, is that sometimes progress happens slowly and deliberately, but it can be noticed and measured over the course of years. Georgia in 2019 was not a good offensive team, and we talked openly about that. They were only averaging about 21 points per game in SEC play. That's a failure. And Georgia got blown out in the SEC title game in large measure because of that. That's why Todd Monken was brought in. And the Monken results have been unmistakable against SEC-only opponents in a 10-game plus Cincinnati 10-game season in 2020. You know, Georgia was scoring far more points per game than it had the previous year against the same level of competition. And in 2021, Georgia was one of the 10 best offenses in the entire sport. Georgia was one of the 10 best offenses in the entire sport. So, you know, the idea that Monken somehow takes blame, what Monken takes is credit for bringing a national championship to Georgia. Let's go asking about more news on Arch Manning. I saw, and I should have done this for the SEC through. I saw where Nick Saban and Pete Golding, and was Bill O'Brien there too? They went to see Arch Manning play basketball there as well. That's the second time so far in 2022 that Saban's been a step slow in comparison to Kirby Smart in Georgia. Obviously, the Georgia coaches were there to see Manning play basketball several days ago. Step late, dollar short. Nick Saban and that staff were there to see him. So that's the latest I have on Arch. The Alabama staff was in person to watch him play basketball recently. Dante Green says defenses died when they took the hard hits out. I'm going to say this very briefly. I'm going to move off of this because I think a lot of the obsession that certain media types have with very offensive football, like, you know, Big 12 type football, celebrating, for as good as the game was, you know, celebrating Mahomes and Allen and sort of pretending that's the only kind of football that matters at all, and celebrating the same thing, even though in college football it's actually not producing national championships as much as some people want to act like it's going to. I think part of the agenda pushing that is an anti-physicality agenda. I'll say this one time and I'll move off because I don't want to be like a conspiracy theorist. But there are definitely people that just don't like what football is. They just don't like it. They don't like the physicality. They don't like the masculinity. They just don't like football. And so making football into something more finesse and celebrating all of that at the expense of reducing the impact of the physicality of the game. And listen, we're all for player safety and things like that, but the physicality is a part of the game. Yet there are some people who want to diminish that as much as possible. The NCAA came out with a thing the other day, further reducing the amount of physical contact in spring practice, at least suggesting that as a new rule change. There are some people who just don't like the physicality in the game, and those are the people, at least in the media sphere, who sometimes embrace the 7-on-7 style the most because that's taking football away from a physical plays. I'll say that once and then just kind of move off of it. Let's see what else. Cousin Eddie says maybe playing more than 2 wide receivers would have helped Alabama. Maybe that's what Kirby's doing, things that make you scratch your head. So I think it's a very reasonable debate to go along with Cousin Eddie here. And we talked to Terrence Edwards about this 2 weeks ago. I asked Terrence about the notion that Georgia does rotate at wide receiver a lot. And I asked Terrence if he thought that was a good thing or not. You can go back and listen to what his answer is. But you can absolutely debate this. Now, in 2020, Georgia actually didn't rotate at wide receiver quite so much. That's 2 seasons ago. They didn't rotate quite so much that year. But you can kind of go back and look over the years, Georgia does typically play a lot of wide receivers. I remember one time I was going to chart receivers, and I mean, that's hard to do because, I mean, they're changing they're just changing so much, almost wholesale changes, on virtually every single play, at least in the past, it's kind of been the case. And you can say, well, that's not a good thing. They should play 3 receivers the majority of the time. That's what LSU did in 2019. They had Chase and Terrace Marshall and Jefferson on the field almost all the time. They didn't rotate very much. And that sounds like a really good idea as long as you think you're one of the 3. But listen, let's just be frank here for a moment. And listen, I like Jermaine Burton. I'm not going to trash Jermaine Burton. I like Jermaine Burton. But it is just a fact that if Georgia had only played 3 receivers for good portions of the season, Burton would not have been one of those 3. I mean, at one point in time, it seemed like he may have been off the field a little bit for reasons other than just injury. That the rotational thing has also benefited Burton too. Now, in most instances, has Burton been one of Georgia's 3 best? Clearly that's the case. But let's say that Georgia had played A.D. Mitchell less. Would Mitchell been as ready as he was to catch the final offensive touchdown in Georgia's national championship win? Probably not. See, this is where you just have to be candid and be real. That, of course, Burton's going to make what he thinks is the best decision for him, and he thinks he's going to go to Alabama and get more touches and more stats and more everything else. But Burton's biggest issue at Georgia was not just that the offense didn't showcase him or Kirby didn't like him or Stetson Bennett instead of J.T. Daniels. Some of Burton's biggest issue was that he wasn't really distancing himself as a player from Ladd McConkey and A.D. Mitchell and guys like that very well. And that's just a fact that this notion that Georgia ought to have 3 receivers who were way better than everybody else, in 2020, they were happy to kind of play that way. In 2021, I'm not quite so sure that Mr. Burton distinguished himself as maybe much as he thinks that he could have or should have. Foster Moss, did I get it wrong? Maybe Brock's touchdown did come after AD's. You're right about that. I apologize. My bad. My bad on that. You're right. The A.D. Mitchell touchdown was the one that gave Georgia the lead. Let me say that right. Yeah, you're right. Jermaine Jones, I'll just be frank with you. Your ability to break down film's more impressive to you than it is to me. I'll just be frank with you. Robert Barnes says your average fan doesn't understand how important special teams are. That blocked field goal during the national championship game was huge at the time. Totally agree with that. Let's see what else. TN Dog says, I haven't seen any elite wide receivers in the portal available. Yeah, I mean, there's a very good chance that what Georgia brings in is not even as famous as, most Georgia fans had some idea of who Darien Kendrick was when he arrived from Clemson. That's a pretty well-known guy. Been a starter at Clemson, former big-time recruit, played in college football playoff. When Kendrick came here a year ago, he's a pretty well-known guy. By comparison, Tyke Smith, although he had done some very credible things at West Virginia, was not nearly as famous. That the odds are the receiver that comes in, I think eventually one will, is someone of a stature a little more closely aligned with what Tyke may have been, more so than Darien Kendrick. Folks knew who Kendrick was. Very good chance the receiver that Georgia brings in just simply won't be nearly as famous. Let's see else. Devil Dog says special teams. Ask Green Bay how important game changer special teams are. I did see some game changer stuff on Twitter about the Packers. I did see that. Matthew Maddox also kind of wondering where Georgia is in the transfer portal. I mean, I really don't think that Georgia's behind schedule in terms of, what it's adding or anything like that. Eventually that's where Georgia's going to be. And who knows? There may be names in the transfer portal eventually that are not in there right now. And that's the other thing to kind of keep in mind here too. That, Georgia's not going to be bound by just simply what's in there right now. Georgia's looking for the kind of player that fits it. Plus, Georgia's also the kind of program that the availability of a spot also is going to attract players into the transfer portal. And I'd also say that if, no one's going to step up and say anything about, Georgia having players tampered with and recruited off its roster, then maybe Georgia should go and do the same thing. Let's see what else. TN Dog says that Monken's the best OC we've had in years. I mean, I don't think there's any disputing that Todd Monken, you talk about, someone who's helped transform Georgia into what was capable of winning a national championship. I don't believe that Georgia would have won the national title this year, likely without Todd Monken. And I'm not saying he's the only guy that could be an effective offensive coordinator, but when you compare Monken's results to almost any previous result for Georgia, even some of the stuff predating Kirby Smart, I think it speaks to what Todd Monken was able to do, for sure. Randy Glass says, what's our chance with Shamar Stewart? I can only go on like what Jeff Sentell has said, and it certainly does not seem like Georgia's in the driver's seat for Shamar really at all. That's either a Miami 1, probably a Texas A&M 2, maybe a Georgia 3 there. Some of that may kind of come down to position fit, situation in terms of what Shamar wants to do as an edge rusher and maybe some of what Georgia thinks he can do. I'm only speculating about that, but it does not sound like Shamar Stewart's on his way to UGA. Christian Miller, maybe so. Shamar Stewart, maybe not quite so much. Chadwick Ivory says tampering should be addressed. Where's the NCAA? Yeah, it's amazing how, and this is not just kind of crying spilled milk because Georgia lost a player, because frankly I'm not even quite so sure that Bama had to temper with Burton. I mean, Burton seemed pretty intent on doing what he wanted to do here, but I do think that, I mean, this doesn't happen in professional sports. A lot of people look at the transfer portal and say, hey, this is just college becoming like professional sports. But honestly, professional sports kind of polices tampering pretty heavily. Now, that doesn't mean that doesn't ever happen. Sometimes it happens player to player, and it becomes a little hard to do anything about that. But for the most part, pro sports take a pretty serious stance against tampering on somebody else's roster. They respect the value of the contract. I would like to see college do a little bit more in that regard. Brian Jones says, tell John Stinchcomb that it's actually coyote mating season for the next 8 weeks. I did not know that. My kids always ask about coyotes, and I always say, well, they only come out at night. I've never seen one in the daytime. Randy Glass says, thanks, BA, from a fellow Gainesville homeboy. That's nice to hear, Randy. I'm happy to hear that. Us Hall County folks got to stick together. That's awesome, Randy. Good to hear. All right, a couple more comments, and we're going to go. So Terry Marsh says this, and it's in all caps, so you know it's important. Bama's best 2 wide receivers went down. That's the only reason that Georgia won. But here's what we're trying to tell you, or at least I'm trying to tell people, that if the entirety of your program rests on 2 wide receivers staying healthy, then you're not as good as you think you are. Like previous Alabama teams would not have been crestfallen by 2 injuries. They just weren't, because they'd be too good on defense, too good with the running game, too good everywhere else. That Alabama is actually a pretty fragile program right now because the entirety of its success depends on small players. Quarterbacks by nature are small in stature. Wide receivers by nature are small in stature. The entirety of this program rests on small players staying healthy. That is a risky proposition, especially when most of these guys don't stay healthy, because Jamison got hurt, Mechie got hurt, Jalen Waddle got hurt the year before that. That these are positions where you are going to have more injuries because the players who are playing these positions are not big and strong in comparison to other players who play the sport. So you can say, well, if Mechie hadn't gone down and Williams hadn't gone down, first of all, that can't be known. The fact of the matter is, when Jameis was playing the first half, it's not like Alabama was marching up and down the field, but nonetheless, that's not the winning argument for Alabama you think that it is. We've acknowledged openly around here that Alabama has a better passing attack than Georgia does. What we've said is that's not necessarily as much of a recipe for winning as some people kind of think that it is. All right, we're going to get ready to go. Big Dog likes the fragile program narrative. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that, Big Dog. Thank you. Robert Barnes says, I'd like to see the SEC come up with some rules about transferring within the conference. Yeah, I wonder what the future of all this kind of looks like. I think, Robert, there's obviously a lot of change afoot here, and doing something to address this and make it a little bit more sensible is I think, pretty important. Scott Green having some fun in here. Good to be able to see that. All right. Final Facebook, finaldawgnation.com. We're gone. Jamie Huff says JT did the tampering. Maybe. Barry Watkins says sometimes you have to wait and see. Yeah, I mean, I really would not be too worried about Georgia and the transfer portal right now. Eventually, it's going to use it. Eventually, it's going to. By the way, we've talked to you before about the book that we're doing. I believe some of you may actually have the book because somebody reached out to me about this. Top Dogs, the book. This may be shipping out right now because somebody referenced my piece there at the end. So it's time. If you want to get yours, you can. 1-800-888-4741. That's 1-800-888-4741 or triumphbooks.com/Georgia Wins. You can also go to DawgNation.com and just see the link there. But if you want to get the Top Dogs book celebrating the national championship for UGA, I believe it must now be shipping out because somebody told me they read it, which is great. Gary Holt says, I think we would have won more national titles if we had Todd Monken as offensive coordinator. I really do think Monken's about as good as they come. I really do. What else? Marcus Chafin says, with Gilbert, Bowers, and Delp at tight end, could we see one of them play wide receiver? Didn't Gilbert want to originally? Yeah, I think that he may be kind of, a little bit more of a receiver now. And, I really think we're kind of getting into a world now where, obviously at the NFL level, you still see tight ends attached a lot. Even a guy like Travis Kelce is attached to the offensive line a pretty good bit. But in the college world, listen, at a place like Georgia, they run kind of a lot of bunch formation type stuff, tight ends included, but all the different ways in which, even people say that Darnell doesn't get enough touches, but even the way in which Darnell gets used, they have him spread out wide and slot and this and that and the other. I think the designation between what a tight end is and what a wide receiver is getting more and more blurry by the day. I really do. It's still somewhat different because, tight ends are typically better blockers and, Georgia's always going to have at least one tight end truly attached to the offensive line. But honestly, Georgia does enough crack back blocks with wide receivers and things like that that even is not quite so different anymore. That I really don't personally obsess over the difference at the college level between wide receivers and tight ends because the way in which Georgia used Bowers this year essentially made him like a wide receiver anyway. But yeah, I would say that Georgia's going to continue to push that even more. Obviously, Delp likes the idea of that, and Arian Gilbert, assuming he's back, kind of likes that there too. All right, we got to go. Very good stuff. Brian Kirk, thank you for the kind words. I appreciate that. Philip Jordan Wells says, Bama fans on here want my attention. Yeah, listen, they've been trying to get my attention for years. Right now, I can't see them over the national championship trophy. And I can't, yeah. Steve Highland, thank you for ordering the book. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. James Leonard Brown says, I still feel like Georgia's going to be better than Alabama in 2022. Yeah, James, I'm glad to hear you say this, and we'll finish with that today. I'm sort of amazed at how few people seem to be viewing that as a realistic possibility right now. I find that to be pretty amazing. I really do. But, James, I think you could be onto something. Lucy Bowers Boykin, thanks for the kind words there as well. Big thanks to all of you. Don't forget to check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com. If your water heater goes out, in many cases, RS Andrews can replace it for you the same day, but you got to find them online at rsandrews.com. Also, don't forget to check out the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Told you about the book, Top Dogs. It's available right now, but also great coverage as well. Big weekend in the NFL. Good stuff there from the AJC on that. Also, let me tell you about this. So there's expanded sports coverage coming online now. I want you to be aware of this. It's called Sports Insider. It's going to be a weekly deep dive in the world of sports. All kinds of really cool stuff. One of my favorite things about the Atlanta Journal-Constitution is just the really good photography, especially during Georgia's championship run. That's one of the things that's going to make the Top Dogs, the book, so cool is all the photographs that are in there. But obviously the AJC just has, part of the reason why they have such good photographs, they hire an army of photographers. For the Braves parade, they had 9 people shooting photographs. It's just a really big organization from a photography standpoint. So that's going to be a big part of all this, but also just really good coverage and news there as well. So if you go to this website, it's ajc.com/sportsinsider. ajc.com/sportsinsider. And you can get kind of a little bit of a trial on that and kind of try that. And then after February 12th, that's going to become available only to AJC subscribers. So my invitation is kind of check this out if you want more sports coverage, especially for like Braves, Falcons, Hawks, things like that. ajc.com/sportsinsider is going to be a great way to get some of that. You can try it for free between now and February 12th. Then after that, it becomes a great bonus for an AJC subscriber. Always fun to get really good sports coverage. This is a very interesting time in the life of a lot of these sports franchises here around our state and in our city for those who live in the Atlanta area. So you can check out more of that online at ajc.com and specifically ajc.com/sportsinsider. So check that out. Hope you have a great day as well, and we'll see you back here tomorrow, 10 a.m. for DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, 9:45 for our 1st and 15 at DawgNation.com and on the DawgNation app. We'll look forward to speaking to you then.